the big one that I hear often from people is that they did not appreciate the strategic threat that Hamas posed to Israel. It very much was seen still as an annoyance, as a problem. Yes, they had some deadly capabilities, but we had it under control. And clearly we didn't have it under control. And Israel is paying the price in this longest war of ever for the state that continues to drag on.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Hope you're ready for another episode of Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. Now, let's dive in. Okay, well, first off, the title of the book, right? While Israel Slept, How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East. That's the first time, and this might be from me not paying, or having an absolute pulse on it, but I don't often, and I can't really remember having heard of somebody describing it as Israel sleeping. I'm curious why you came up with that particular title. Not that it's obviously not based on what you've experienced and reported on, but it's just not a title that has been leading the news, shall we say?
Well, it's a great question, and I think it stems from two different places. The first is that in our reporting, we definitely came away with the feeling that October 7th came from a deep place of complacency that Israel found itself in. It believed very much in what I now call a fairy tale. But I'm someone who also believed and agreed with the defense establishment and the politicians who were all saying at the time that Hamas is deterred. Hamas does not want war. Hamas wants economic prosperity. And therefore, anytime that we would see Hamas arming or training or saying something genocidal, it would be written off as if this isn't what they really mean. We knew, or we learned on October 7th, that was all wrong. And clearly something was off in the way Israel had approached this threat that was brewing on its southern border, and in the way that it assessed what Hamas's intentions were and what it was actually planning. And that felt like a state of that we were asleep as a country, that the military, the intelligence agencies, the political echelon was not awake in recognizing what was happening. But really what also came was when I heard that JFK had written a book back at the end of the 40s, which was called Why England Slept. And it was after he graduated from Harvard. There's some rumors I've read or reports that it was actually ghost written for him by someone else. Could be, don't know. But the title was Why England Slept. And I felt that was also, it gave me some inspiration to choose this title, as I changed it from why to while, because I felt that so much happened while Israel was sleeping. It wasn't just what led Israel to sleep, but it was also what was happening all these years that Hamas went from being a small scale little insurgency, and you know a lot about those organizations from your past.
Unfortunately,
but when it started small, and the way it was initially perceived by the Israeli military and intelligence agencies, and then what it grew into when it exploded into our borders on October 7th.
I definitely want to unpack Hamas for sure, because I think it is important for people to understand the size, scope, and scale, what it was in the past and what it grew into. But I'm interested, you use the term fairy tale. What was the origin of that fairy tale? Like, who was telling this story, and why do you think it stuck?
It's a great question. You know, the origin, I think, and I'm originally from the United States, grew up in Chicago. I've been living now in Israel for just over 30 years. I've spent almost my entire career here as a journalist, author, writing about and telling the story of this country to the world, mostly on military affairs. And I feel that really at the core of Israelis is this deep desire to just be accepted, to live quietly and peacefully. It's the reason why Israel, over 77 years, has really tried to make peace with its neighbors. Now, I know that sounds controversial today, but it gave up the Sinai to make peace with the Egyptians. It made peace with Jordan. It walked away from Gaza 20 years ago, as we speak, and gave it to the Palestinian Authority. Then Hamas took over. It pulled out of Lebanon back in 2000 to only get attacked in 2006 by Hezbollah and what became known as the Second Lebanon War. It constantly tried to give away territory in order to achieve peace, and really came from this place of where Israelis, what they really just want at the end of the day is for this region to accept them, not to want to destroy them, not to want to attack them. And unfortunately, the sad story is that this country is in a region, it's in a tough neighborhood. And unfortunately, all along its borders are people who want otherwise for Israel. They don't want to accept Israel. And I think that's at the core. And that's what leads people to believe when they see a threat growing or they see a terrorist group that's just starting. But they say to themselves, one second, when Hamas started back in the 1980s, it started as what was known as Mujama Islamiyah. It was the Islamic Association. And let's think about what was happening in Gaza in the 1980s. Israel was in charge, right? Israel was the military control of Gaza and also civil control. And the main enemy or adversary of Israel was what was known as the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Yasser Arafat, we all remember hijackings of airplanes, attacks on Jewish targets around the world, attacks within Israel, of course, and Gaza and the West Bank. But they were the main adversary. Now, they were secular Muslims, right? This was not an Islamic organization. Came Sheikh Yassin. He's the famous Palestinian sheikh, spiritual leader of Hamas. He was born in Gaza, and he was bound to a wheelchair. So that's why people might remember him, old guy in a wheelchair back in the 2000s, 1990s. But in 1980, he came to the Israeli authorities and said, I would like a license to establish an Islamic association in Gaza. I want to create an Islamic university. I want to set up some mosques. I want to, inspire the youth to follow the way of the Muslim world. And Israel gave him that license, actually. Sheikh Yassin himself was actually on the Israeli payroll. He was a teacher in a school in Gaza. The Israeli civilian authorities were paying for his salary. And quickly, what this Mujama turned into was they started to amass weapons. They started to practice and train. But Israel saw this happening and said, it's not a problem for us. They want to be a counterweight to our enemy, the PLO, the seculars, the Fatah guys. So Israel kind of turned a blind eye to it. But then things started to change, of course, as sadly they often do. And the weapons that they amassed and the training that they underwent quickly shifted from being used against Fatah and the secular Palestinians to being used against Israel. So when we look at that, it's obviously easy to say today, oh, we should have, would have, could have. But I think there's a lot of lessons because this is not going to be the last challenge. It's not going to be the last threat or the last enemy that Israel is going to have to fight against, or any Western country for that matter. And therefore, it's really important to think about things in their historical context to see how they develop and how they evolve. And what if something different had happened back then? Because these will be challenges that we will face, all of us in the Western world will face again now or in the future.
Some crazy parallels there to what you're describing when it comes to Al-Qaeda as well, and how that grew and exploded, putting the lens on for the Western audience more familiar with the U.S. and the events post 9/11. Yeah, it's what started off maybe seemingly small and was dismissed, it got to a place where it was undeniable.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so that was the origin of Hamas. Can you bring me up to speed? How would you describe it today through the lens militarily, politically, and ideologically?
Well, Hamas has gone through a bunch of different kind of incarnations, if we could call it that. What started after those 1980s and then into the 90s, the suicide bombings began. And it really had morphed into a brutal terrorist group that Israel was fighting in a very pinpointed kind of precision way, just trying to take out one bad guy here, one bad guy there, occasionally doing arrest raids, but nothing at a large scale. Fast forward to the 2000s, when what became known as the Second Intifada erupted. It was a 5-year period during which 1,000 Israelis were killed in suicide attacks and buses and coffee shops and restaurants and schools all across Israel, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, you name it. And these were mostly carried out by Hamas. And Hamas really grew. It grew in numbers, it grew in arms. And that's when Israel also started to see the Iranian tentacles making their way into Gaza. It started to see the support that Hamas was getting from the Iranians in funding, in training, in know-how, but also in weapons. Lots of ships were captured during that period that were being sent by Iran through Syria or Lebanon on their way to try to make it to Gaza to bring sophisticated long-range rockets, anti-tank weapons, you name it, to get them into Gaza. Some of them succeeded. That was also the period when Hamas started to dig those big tunnels along the border with Egypt, what's known as the Philadelphia Corridor, about a 7-mile long border between Gaza and Egypt, where they had tunnels literally that were now discovered over the last 2 years of this war that you could drive a Humvee through. You could drive a truck in some of them. And they had a highway of weaponry that was coming into the Gaza Strip. Hamas turned into a real enemy for Israel. But again, it was an enemy that was believed to be not one of a strategic capacity, but a problem, a terrorist group a thorn in Israel's side, but not one that needed the country to have to or change or modify its larger objectives or its diplomatic policies or political visions, right? It was seen there as a problem, but we could try to still make peace and negotiate with the Palestinian Authority, the partner for the Oslo Accords, the partner for other agreements, try to deal with Hamas, isolate it, but still work with the Palestinians in Ramallah in the West Bank. But then in the mid-2000s, when it was already too much, we started to see that Israel began its operations in Gaza in a big way. In 2005, Israel pulled out of Gaza. 2006, one soldier was kidnapped. Israel launched its first operation. Then 2009, another big operation. And then every 2 years or so, it was almost like a game of whack-a-mole. Hamas would do something, they'd fire a rocket, Israel would hit them back. Then you'd have a year or two of quiet, and then it would start again. And then another thing happened, which is interesting. Israel developed Iron Dome, which is one of the most amazing systems in the world. It's a missile defense system. It went operational back in 2013. But this also led, on the one hand, I like to say Iron Dome is really one of the most amazing, incredible systems that are out there. Protects lives, saves lives, protects infrastructure. But what it also does is it made it seem that these rockets that were being fired by Hamas, the first rocket was fired in 2000, 2001, and they slowly, over the years, they became bigger and larger and longer range and larger warheads, and because they were smuggling in and they were creating their own manufacturing and production plants. So when Iron Dome went live, Israelis suddenly said, 1 second, the rockets aren't a strategic problem either because we can intercept them. So Hamas would fire 5 rockets, Israel would intercept them, and everyone would say, okay, nothing happened. We don't have to respond. We don't have to retaliate. And that led also to this containment policy. We have a missile defense system. We have a big fence on the border. We have troops along the border. Why do we care what they're doing inside Gaza? They can't really do anything. We don't have people in Gaza. We pulled our people out in 2005. They can't kill anyone in Gaza. They can try to fire rockets, but we'd intercept 90% of them. So what's the threat really? And that's where Israel started to do things that now in hindsight we understand were an existential mistake. Israel, for example, went to the Qataris in about 2015, 2016, and said, hey, can you guys give money to Hamas? We're asking you to pay them every month, $30, $40, $50 million. And that happened for a period of years. We were essentially enabling extortion money to be paid to Hamas. Some of that money was used for their military wing. Some of that money was used probably for the welfare of the people of Gaza. But for the most part, Israel was essentially enabling money to go into the bank accounts of Hamas to be used by Hamas to dig tunnels, to build up more weapons, to continue to create their command centers and their underground launch sites and much more. And that's where Hamas was on October 7th. It was an organization that had about 20,000 fighters, a terrorist group with tens of thousands of rockets, not many long range, but some definite good amount of about 1,000 or 2,000 longer range. When I say longer range, I mean about 30, 40 miles. In other words, able to strike in some of the big population centers like Tel Aviv, even start to inch up on Jerusalem, where I live. And when they invaded Israel on that morning, it was obviously the most horrific attack against Israel in its history. It was the single day that the most Jews were killed and murdered since the Holocaust on one single day, about 1,200 people, and 251 obviously taken hostage, which is still something that Israel is dealing with. But what it did, and this is what Israel awoke to when it went into Gaza, was understanding that Hamas had lined Gaza literally with hundreds and hundreds of miles of tunnels. That was a complete surprise to the Israeli military and to the intelligence agencies. And if I could just say one word about that and how that came as a surprise, because I mentioned before, we knew about the tunnels. We knew they were using them to smuggle.
Yeah.
And even in 2006, they had crossed into Israel and had kidnapped a soldier that way. And then in 2014, they crossed into Israel in tunnels and killed a few soldiers. So we knew they had cross-border tunnels. And we knew they had tunnels inside Gaza as well, as command centers, bunkers for their top leaders. But here was the thing, and this is part of this asleep scenario. Israel believed, what was the threat? Just those cross-border tunnels. Can they get into Israel? Can they not get into Israel? So Israel built systems, underground walls, different detection systems and sensors to try to detect when and if they're digging a tunnel. But the tunnels inside Gaza, those Israel said, oh, we don't care about those because we're never going to go into Gaza in a big way because, again, it's a contained threat. And that's one of the reasons that this war has dragged on for so long, is because Israel had to map these tunnels out from pretty much from zero without knowing anything about them when the beginning of the ground offensive began in late October 2023.
It's wild. It's wild that they didn't have an understanding of the scope and scale of those tunnels. And I say that because Israel is renowned to have some of the best intelligence capabilities of first world countries. How do you think it was just a matter of they weren't looking, they didn't have the human that you may want to have? I mean, there's so many questions. Another one of those questions, and this is a difficult conversation, I think, from people who are in the West who have never been to an area like that in the world and don't understand, my personal opinion here, that it's impossible for that level of infrastructure to be built without at least tacit knowledge of those in the area that it is happening. I'm not saying they're necessarily supporting, but there is no way that that tunnel system is being developed absent the knowledge of the people that are in that area. And that's a conversation in itself, and I do want to get into that for sure. But how do you think that the Israeli intelligence organizations missed those bigger tunnel systems? I mean, that's an undertaking, no pun intended, to develop that level of infrastructure.
Let me raise your question even, Andy, because what we've seen in the 22, 23 months since the war that has transpired, look at what Israel did to Hezbollah with the beeper, the pager attack. I mean, wow.
Strong work.
Right?
I'm a
to
fan.
be able to put explosives in thousands of beepers. And from your experience, that's one part of it. How do you get Hezbollah to buy these pagers, right? I mean, think of the sophistication of the supply chain, the front office. I mean, look at what Israel was able to do taking out Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. Look at what it was able to do with Iran in penetrating its air defense systems and taking out its nuclear scientists, its top military leadership. So you look at that and you say, 1 second, Israel has amazing capabilities. How come with Gaza it didn't? It where was all that, right? And I think the answer, and by the way, this has led to some conspiracy theories here, right? There are people.
Welcome to the club. We have a little problem with those in the U.S. I was going to say currently, but it might be forever.
So because people say it doesn't make sense, it must be somebody there was a mole on the inside. Somebody shut off the systems or whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's sadly, tragically, it's just simpler. What you see with Hezbollah and Iran is that when you identify the threat to be of a strategic level and capacity, you allocate the resources, you recruit those human intelligence, those agents on the ground. You make sure you have your spies there. You have the Mossad and the Shin Bet and military intelligence. Everybody's focused, and you're doing these amazing operations like the beepers and pagers, like the way they were able to take out the Iranian nuclear scientists, and so much more. When you don't appreciate the gravity of this threat, when you think to yourself, I'm never going into Gaza in that way, so I don't care about those tunnels. Let them have those tunnels in there. I just care about the ones that cross my border. And Israel succeeded, by the way. I mean, it's interesting. On October 7th, about 3,000 people crossed into Israel, most of them Hamas fighters. There were a bunch of looters also who later came in to loot the Israeli communities. Not a single person crossed into Israel through a tunnel, because Israel had effectively stopped the underground cross-border attack tunnels. But it didn't do a good enough job in defending that border, because it wasn't looking at what was happening in the right way. It didn't appreciate how Gaza, and I've heard, by the way, I've sat with so many members of Israel's security cabinet, top leaders of the defense establishment. And the thing I hear most often is we did not, people saying, looking back, where did we go wrong? What did we not understand? What's the lesson to learn from all of this? The big one that I hear often from people is that they did not appreciate the strategic threat that Hamas posed to Israel. It very much was seen still as an annoyance, as a problem. Yes, they had some deadly capabilities, but we had it under control. And clearly we didn't have it under control. And Israel is paying the price in this longest war of ever for the state that continues to drag on.
Ladies and gentlemen, hot salt from Firecracker Farm is the real deal. It's not just heat, it's flavor that elevates everything that you cook. The best thing to happen to food since fire. That's a bold statement, but I'm going to go ahead and agree with that. It's delightful. One of the best things about this brand is there's a real person behind it. His name is Alex, and he makes these in small batches, so it's not always easy to get. You don't want to miss out. All of the flavors are great. I have tried all of them. You really can't go wrong. Seriously, try it on everything. Steaks, vegetables, everything in between. If you like milder heat, mix in some sea salt to dilute it. This is a choose your own adventure. You can go direct from the push button dispenser, or you can dilute to hit that flavor profile that you're looking for. The best way that you can help this show is to help Alex and his small family business by grabbing some hot salt and trying it for yourself. So go to Firecracker Farm and use the code Ironclad for 15% off of your first order. Alex would also like me to thank you, the audience, for giving his small business a shot. I'm telling you right now, head over to Firecracker Farm, pick something out. I honestly don't think that you can go wrong. It's an amazing product, founded by a very cool person. The backstory behind it is legit, and it's going to make your food taste better. How do you unpack the relationship between Palestinians and Hamas for people? It's a topic that is, I want to say, often accidentally conflated, even though sometimes I think it's very intentionally conflated, because it makes it, depending on where you're viewing it from, it makes it easier or more justifiable to buttress your position. But how do you unpack that relationship? Because again, there is no way, in my own personal opinion, which counts for absolutely nothing, and what I've seen with my own eyes and ears and experiences overseas in two mature theaters of war, there is no way that level of infrastructure was created invisibly underneath the literal feet of the Palestinians without them knowing that was happening. Now, that's not to say that they were directly supporting them, but it's just not possible. And I'm curious how you unpack that relationship and separate those two entities.
It's a very good question, and it really is. It has a lot of, obviously, military significance to it, but also a lot of political context that it requires as well. I mean, I'll first just say that the people of Gaza have suffered a tragedy. Gaza is mostly destroyed at this point into the war. Most of the buildings there have definitely, if they're not destroyed, damage has been caused to them. There are, if we believe the Hamas numbers, and I have no reason to believe them, but let's go with them for a moment. You have about 50 to 60,000 people have been killed. They don't distinguish between combatants and civilians, but we know that lots of civilians have also been caught up in this war and have paid the ultimate price. And it's a tragedy whenever a child definitely gets killed or a civilian is killed. It's tragic.
Agreed.
But what we also know is how deeply embedded Hamas was and continues to be in the civilian infrastructure in Gaza. You're 100% right. You cannot build a tunnel under someone's home without them knowing about it. You can't park a command center or an arms cache or rocket launchers in someone's basement without them knowing about it. You walk in, you talk to soldiers, and I've spoken with many and commanders. Every home you go into, every bedroom almost has a Hamas flag. There are weapons all over the place. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody's a Hamas member. It doesn't mean that everybody would kill an Israeli if they saw them. But this is clearly a territory that has been radicalized in a way that I think no one in the West can really appreciate or understand, right? The only comparison I can think of to some extent is there's obviously, anyone who grew up in a big city. I grew up in Chicago, like I said. There were parts of Chicago you didn't go to as a kid, right?
Yeah.
You just didn't want to go into those parts of the city. Now, this is obviously of a whole other scale. But where you have an area that is completely loaded with weapons, is completely radicalized, the culture is one, and the education system is teaching you to hate and to want to kill, and how evil the Israeli is, and how evil the Israeli people are. This is what happened to Gaza. And look, we see what was going on. Just take one example, Shifa Hospital. This is a big hospital inside Gaza City. Some of the hostages were brought there and treated there on October 7th when they were first taken, those who were wounded. Some of them even spent a few days there. Israel eventually went into Shifa, cleared out the hospital, found crisscrossing tunnels all under the hospital, Hamas command centers underneath the hospital. Now, you want to tell me that the doctors didn't know? The director of Shifa didn't know? Israel eventually caught the director of the hospital. They knew what was going on. They knew there were areas that they were not allowed to have access to. Now, it's not that I would have expected them to do something about it. Were held hostage by Hamas, and they are also victims of this war. And by the way, this is why war is terrible. And I don't have to tell you, you know much better than all of us, right? How terrible war is. This is part of the reason why Israel wanted to avoid this for so many years, right? Because it didn't want to have to go into a war that it knew would bring so much destruction to its own people, and of course also to the people of Gaza, and the diplomatic and political fallout that Israel faces now, of course. But this was one of the reasons. War is a terrible thing. But when we look at the consequences of it all, I mean, here we get into really difficult questions. If I know that there's an apartment building and I know there are rockets in the basement that are going to be used to be launched into Israeli cities, can I strike that building or can I not strike that building?
Tough question.
And there's obviously what the law says. There's laws of war. And if it's become a military target and it's used for military purposes, it is a justified and legitimate target. But what happens if there's civilians in that building? This is where you get into the question of proportionality. Now, what's the right proportion? Some people will say it's 10 people who could get killed in that building. Some people will say no civilians can be killed in that building. Some people will say maybe it's 100 people who I'm okay with being killed in that building. There's no scientific answer to any of these questions. And this is what makes this war so difficult, is because of just deeply how embedded they were and continue to be inside the civilian infrastructure. And that's why, just on a personal level, I'll just say my heart really goes out to the people of Gaza. And I hope to an extent that this war removes Hamas as a threat to Israel and to this region, but also frees the Palestinian people of Gaza from the clutches of this group, because they will rebuild and they will re-embed themselves in those hospitals, in those schools, in those homes, just like they were on the eve of October 7th.
Yeah, it's important to remember, you brought up the examples of an apartment complex and a hospital. It's not accidental that you choose a hospital as a command center, because you understand the optic of, it's almost a farce in itself, the rule of war or the law of war. Like, good luck trying to put sanity into an insane environment. But I saw this in specifically with my own eyes in both Afghanistan and Iraq, whether it would be a mosque that they would use for storing weapons or housing fighters, or knowing that we were limited in our ability to approach or prosecute that target or specifically destroy it. It's not accidental they chose that. I can think of a hospital specifically in Iraq. We got down into the basement and there was a full, we call it a sand table. And I'm sure you're familiar with the term, but it's literally, it was sand, and it was a recreation of the entire city. And they used it as a planning module to, at that time, obviously it was to target US forces, but gee, why would they do that? Because they know that it is a measure of absolute last resort to put a munition through the roof of a hospital. But, and again, there are no good answers to this. Like you said, proportionality, it depends on the person you ask. I've also found it also depends if they know anybody involved directly in that particular equation. Like, oh yeah, 100 people's fine. I'm like, okay, cool. You have to pick them out of your social circle. And they're like, oh, no. Take the one off of that. I meant 0 is fine. I'm like, okay, let's at least have an upfront conversation about this. Right. It's really funny how your morality shifts when you don't know anybody who's there. But it's not accidental. And honestly, the truth is, tactically, it's relatively smart, because you know that it's going to be a measure of last resort to take action against those facilities. So you can lever that optic of justice or law or a regulation against the people that you are there, harboring ill intent towards. And I have, it's like the dirtiest water. It's like you're holding up a Ziploc bag of dirty water, trying to see the world through it. It is anything but clear.
I have to tell you this story. In 2018, Israel launched an operation called Black Belt. There are two big, the biggest terrorist organization in Gaza is obviously Hamas. There's another one called the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, also bad guys. They're also been holding some of the hostages, not good people at all. But in 2018, Israel decided it wanted to take out the leader of the Islamic Jihad in Gaza, this guy by the name of Baha Abu al-Atta. And I actually met with the planning team, the Air Force, the pilots. There was an F-15 that dropped the munition, but the military intelligence guys who literally studied his building, and they studied what it was made of, and they analyzed with architects and construction workers and experts on concrete, and they figured out the best way to kill him was to drop this small munition through the window of his bedroom. It would land just on his bed. It would kill just him and his wife, who was sleeping next to him. But the kids in the room next door, it was just small enough to kill just him and his wife, but the kids in the room next door, nothing happened to them. I mean, you saw it took weeks to plan this thing, weeks. Mm-hmm. And Israel did it, and it was successful. They killed this guy and his wife. Kids were fine, traumatized, I'm guessing, but fine otherwise. During the 3 days of this fighting, it was just Israel against Islamic Jihad. Israel saw Hamas guys, said, no, we're not fighting these people. We're just fighting Islamic Jihad. So it just pinpointed and precision, accurate operations and strikes, unlike anything it's seen anywhere, all to try to minimize the scope of this conflict. And we think about this today, in the aftermath of October 7th and what we now know. What was Israel thinking? I mean, obviously you don't want to kill the kids. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But you were going through loops to do everything possible to just kill that one bad guy, when really you had an army of terrorists who were waiting to attack you in a way that you never imagined possible. The whole thing was just not, it wasn't being seen in the right way.
Well, it's a difference in ideology. And I can't explain that chasm of difference in ideology to people who haven't actually encountered it or locked eyes with somebody who is on the axis of their beliefs. And there, the vast majority of people, regardless of what you believe, if they hold an opposite belief of you, you could talk about it, argue about it, and you're going to go on and you're going to live your merry life. But there's a small fraction of people who will kill you for the belief that you have, regardless of what it is. And this is for everybody out there. Wherever belief you have, however altruistic you may think it is, there is a fringe axis element out there that holds the opposite belief. And that difference in ideology, I just don't know how to explain it to people unless they've experienced it. And I'm so thankful that the vast minority of people, or I should say the vast majority of people, will never have to encounter that in real life.
I'll tell you something, because I think you're 100% right. And it's very difficult. I think Israel encountered this difficulty. and still does to some extent. But it's very difficult for people of the Western world, and Israelis look at themselves as being part of the West, to understand how is it possible that someone, a person, a human being, looks like you or I, right? Has 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 ears, 2 eyes, could speak English even. How is it that they see the value of life so different than you or I would see the value of life? How is that possible? And we say to ourselves, if we just talk to them differently, if we just help them have a better life, that will improve things, right? If we just make sure they have jobs and money, then they'll see the light. They'll want a different future for themselves. And sadly, the tragic reality is that it's not true.
Yep.
Is that their future is really one of bloodshed and continued war. That is what they actually want. And it's very difficult to come to terms with that, I think, on a deep kind of, humanistic level almost. It's hard for us people to because we think of strangers you meet, right? We see the good in them. That's oftentimes the automatic instinct.
I'm looking for Ted Bundy. I know he's out there. I mean, he's caught, but Frank Bundy might be out there.
Right. I mean, but people, you want to see the good in someone who you meet. And here it's just sadly, this is not the reality. And that means changing the way you look at the world. And that's very difficult.
It's difficult and it's dangerous too, because I'm always so cautious. I don't want to be an alarmist. There's such truth to the person who cries wolf all the time is eventually going to get ignored. And, the statistics are in your favor. The vast majority of people will never encounter violence like this. And, statistics are great. I think the odds of being bitten by a great white shark are the same as being struck by lightning twice in a day. But tell that to a dude who's being drugged underwater by a great white. He's not going to really care about the stats in that moment. So it's a good conversational point. But the reality is, I don't want to make people paranoid. I don't want to shift people's lens to always looking for the evil, because in my personal experience, at least, it is the minority, but I also don't want them to forget. And that's that tough balance.
It's the need to be vigilant. And I think that, by the way, on that point, when Israel now looks to the future and assesses the threats that it has along its borders, Hezbollah is still in Lebanon, right? There's now the former leader of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, this former al-Qaeda guy, Ahmed Ashara, who's now the leader of Syria, in Syria now. Hamas, whatever the day after looks like in this war, Hamas will still be there. There will still be Kalashnikovs and AK-47s, and they'll still have a couple of Cornet anti-tank missiles and the ability to launch an attack here or there. The question that Israel really has to ask themselves, and we get into this in the book, is, okay, what do I do in the future now? How do I prevent these groups from rebuilding themselves, from reamassing and becoming 5 years or 10 years from now that great threat that we saw explode on our borders on October 7th? And I think it requires of the country, and I hear this from the decision makers, the policy guys, we're going to have to adopt a policy of preemptive strikes. We won't be able to sit and say, "No, you know what? It's just a couple of guys with a rocket. We don't have to do anything." Or we'll just mark down where they're burying that rocket, or we see them digging a tunnel, we'll just put down where it's going to be. You're going to have to act now, because you can't allow that situation to repeat itself. And you've seen, definitely when it comes to Lebanon, because there has been a ceasefire now for several months with Hezbollah, is that Israel continues to operate there. If it sees a Hezbollah operative, it takes them out. If it sees them moving weapons, it attacks. It is maintaining that high level of vigilance. Can it be maintained for good? Probably not. At some point, it will have to stop. But that is an important message, and it also carries with it other significance. It means, and I mentioned this before, what do Israelis really want? To live in peace and quiet. Maintaining this type of policy means you're not. It means you're constantly going to be fighting, at a low level, low intensity conflict. But it means you got to be living with the sword in your hand all the time. And that's a tough reality to come to terms with. But I think it is one of the main lessons of October 7th.
I also think that it applies to almost every nation. I mean, human beings have been fighting since the inception, whatever belief system you may have, since the inceptions of humans. As soon as we figured out how to pick stuff up and beat each other with it, that's how we solved arguments. And to truly have a culture where there is peace where you live, you have to have people out there standing with their toes on the line, willing to take a bite out of somebody's ass in other areas of the world. It's an interesting dichotomy. You want peace, but to do so, you have to be able to take action in an order that is in the opposite direction of peace. Like you said, much better at a micro scale. But if you look at the policy of the United States, right, 2 mature theaters of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, 20 years of occupation, I think we proved pretty well that we can break things, putting things back together, not that great. But the threat is still out there. It is just so disaggregate across so many different countries. And now instead of those, 80, 100,000 people, it's small remote operating areas relying heavily on SIGINT, on HUMINT, and striking when they need to. I don't know. And then, of course, there's this Jacob's ladder argument. Well, aren't you potentially radicalize people with these strikes? And the answer is yes, you potentially are. But what, you know what I mean? Like, which risk is more dangerous, not taking action and it's never going to end. The policy of peace is there needs to be somebody with the sword there to ensure that it sticks. And for a lot of people, that's a concept that it kind of explodes their brain a little bit.
100%. You mentioned just now SIGINT. When we looked at Gaza, we met for this book with the heads of the intelligence agencies, and there's one unit in the IDF, in the Israel Defense Forces, that's called by its number 504. It's a unit that operates human agents, live agents behind enemy lines. It has a couple of different departments, but the main one is the group of soldiers who actually are the handlers of these agents, wherever they might be. On the eve of October 7th, Israel had 0 human intelligence assets on the ground inside Gaza. I mean, I was
going to ask you about that. I was going to ask you if there were warning signs.
You had, the way I kind of look at it, you had at the end of the day 3,000 people who crossed into Israel. Now, a lot of them were people who probably just got the phone call, hey, the border's breached, let's go. Mm-hmm. But you had a group of good number of people who were getting ready for this to happen. You didn't have one guy who could pick up the phone and call his handler and say, hey, we're coming, get ready, do something. It's mind-boggling, and it showed the Hezbollah, Lebanon different, Syria different, Iran we know very, very different. But it goes back to that issue that we spoke about before, that we thought that with standoff capabilities, with precision strikes, with signal intelligence, we could know what's going on, right? I mean, one of the stories we tell in the book is how on the night between October 6th and October 7th, about 100 phones in Gaza went live with Israeli SIM cards, right? Which that basically means that Israel was sitting on the network, the cell network in Gaza. So it knew when new phones, if they were in Gaza, suddenly had an Israeli SIM card. Now, why would they put in an Israeli SIM card? They have their own Palestinian cell network. Is only if they're planning to maybe cross into Israel, and then they would need to have cell coverage in Israel. So when the analysts saw this happening, it obviously set off an alarm, and people started to get, okay, something might be happening. But then they looked back and they saw that last year they had done the same thing. They turned on but this time it was about 25, 30 phones. So they said, okay, maybe this is their annual test. And when they put the pieces of everything that they saw happening together, they came up with the solution, with the answer, the unfortunate answer. This is probably just a drill by Hamas. They really don't mean this is not about attacking, when in fact this was, because they relied too much on the systems. Yeah. They relied too much on the electronic capabilities, but they weren't seeing, and you know this, intelligence is very easy to count things, right? I can count how many weapons you have. I can count how many soldiers you have, how many rockets and missiles, but it's hard for me to get in someone's head. And that's always going to be, so intentions are much more difficult than capabilities to assess. And that's where Israel lost big time.
You don't want to back away from that. I fight on always.
Scene 101A, take 3.
If you're prepared for the worst case scenarios, those worst case scenarios are gonna be manageable.
I got out because we weren't at war. We're at war. I'm going back.
I want to quit like anybody else. I just have the mentality I don't.
I thought I knew what pain was up until that moment.
Accuracy is by far the most important thing.
This community aided in who I am. It gave me family.
No fail it's everything. It's a way of life.
All right, action.
How direct is the tie between Iran and Hamas? Are they consumer facing, like this is an organization that we support, or do they still try to deny their support, whether it's through training, equipment, material, all of those things?
They don't deny it at all. It's interesting because when you think about Iran, right? Iran is they're Shiite Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
Hamas are Sunni Muslims. They come from the Muslim Brotherhood. So they're on opposing sides, so-called, of the Islamic religious divide, right?
Yeah.
Which has
That's
a lot of
interesting.
tension in
Yeah.
of itself. We know of Iran's tense relations with the rest of the Sunni states, definitely those within the Persian Gulf, the Emirates, the Saudis, Bahrain, etc. But Iran saw an opportunity with Hamas as part of its larger vision, and this was the vision of Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the Quds Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, of the IRGC. He was the guy who Donald Trump had killed at Baghdad International Airport back in January of 2020 when he was president.
Yep.
Soleimani was responsible for building up this army of proxies for Iran. It was part of its vision of trying to create a regional hegemony throughout the Middle East. Its great success story, at least it thought it was Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah, it started as a small-scale terrorist group back in the 1980s and grew into a fierce military which basically took over the country of Lebanon, right? That it was de facto the leader of the country of Lebanon. For Hezbollah, for Iran, Hezbollah was the model that it wanted to replicate in other parts of the world. It's been trying to do that with the Houthis in Yemen in a war that continues. It's terrible for the people of Yemen. Israel has also suffered missile attacks by the Houthis from Yemen. But then it also saw the opportunity in Hamas. In the beginning, it was below the radar. They kept it quiet because mostly of that religious divide. But in the last 10, 15 years, what you've seen is the Ayatollah himself, Ali Khamenei, meeting with Hamas leaders in Tehran. You've seen meetings between Hamas leaders and Soleimani, and then Soleimani's successor, who was then killed in the Israeli attacks in June against Iran. Iran has made no secret of how Hamas is one of the proxies that benefits not just from financial aid and weaponry that was smuggled into Gaza, but also technical data and know-how. And Israel uncovered evidence, documents in Gaza during during this war that has been continuing inside those tunnels and Hamas command centers, showing the communications between Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah, how they tried to coordinate this into a singular, unified attack against Israel. It didn't happen in the end. It seems, if you ask the Israelis, it seems that Hamas jumped the gun a bit. They got a little too trigger happy, and they decided to go at it first. Hezbollah joined a day or two later. But this was meant to be something of a multi-front attack from Gaza, from Lebanon, and with missiles also from Iran.
Is there any evidence that Iran has actually hosted Hamas fighters and done any type of technical training in Iran? Or are they supporting largely via proxy?
There's evidence of Hamas fighters who have trained in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Iran as well over the years, yes.
Yeah, okay. So the ties are well established at this point then. It's been interesting, and again, as somebody who is thousands of miles away from this conflict, there has been a battle to shape the narrative around October 7th, depending on what side you may sit on. And I'm curious, if you had a blank slate and were to describe what occurred that day and what led up to it, how would you describe to the world, what would you want people to understand about what happens or what happened that day and what led up to it that is just, it's not penetrating the traditional media or social media ecosystem?
Well, I mean, October 7 was really probably the most horrific day in Israeli history. To see Hamas trucks, pickup trucks, those white Toyota pickup trucks driving through the streets of Israeli cities in the south, shooting, attacking, blowing up, stories of the rape, of just the burning of bodies, the decapitation. I mean, some of the worst things that you can even imagine, right? How people could do things like this. But that in itself happened, and I think that was what led to this outpour of sympathy and a feeling that Israel had to do something and had to respond. I think what a lot of people forget, though, is that before October 7th, there was a ceasefire. Israel saw Hamas building up its capabilities, right? As we tell in the book, Israel knew of what Hamas, of arms, of training, of rocket capabilities. It saw the training camps where they practiced how they would abduct people. And Israel held back and didn't do anything. And now we look at that and we say, that was irresponsible. But let's play it differently. Let's say Israel had preempted, had launched an attack on Gaza. Would the world have stood by and applauded and said to Israel, great job, good that you're doing this? I mean, look what happened in the aftermath of that attack on October 7th. Look at the condemnations that Israel faces, still, even more so today. This is a war that sadly continues because it's very difficult to find the good outcome, right? I remember on October 8th saying to someone, imagine for a moment that we're able to get back all the hostages, all 251. But it means that Hamas, we don't go into Gaza, and Hamas remains standing, and it remains in control of Gaza. Is that a win? Because we got back the hostages? And I said, one person could say, yeah, it's a victory because we got back the hostages. The other person would say, what are you talking about? That means we lost the war, right? They won. Mm-hmm. And what if I say the opposite? We'll go in there. We'll destroy Hamas. We'll degrade them. We'll topple them. But the hostages will be lost, or at least most of them will be lost. Is that a victory? And you'll have one person who will say yes and one person who will say no. Without the hostages, it's a complete failure. This was always going to be an impossible war in that sense. And I think that people don't understand the complexity of what it is for a conventional military, what it is for a democracy, what it is for people who seek life to fight against an enemy of this kind and this nature.
Will Israel ever do something like the United States did with the 9/11 Commission? Because they produced a real page turner of a 18,000 page book.
Yeah,
but in that it was an interesting. Portions of it were an interesting read. Some of it was very dry, but it spoke to a lot of the things that we've covered. There, it wasn't that it was invisible. There were so many things that we changed, some for the better, some for the worse. I would point at the Patriot Act as maybe one of the worst things that came out of that. But, streamlining communication or making, shared databases where information can be shared, because it's not like in that particular incident, in that postmortem, which of course they had all the time in the world to dig as deeply as they wanted to, now that it was very targeted and narrowed towards a group of people, shocking what kind of information came out. It's like, yeah, you can't do that when there's millions of people you're trying to sort your way through. But it showed that all the warning signs were essentially there, that just the puzzle wasn't connected appropriately. Do you know if Israel plans to do some type of postmortem like that so they can have changes going forward?
Israel needs desperately a state commission of inquiry into what happened ahead of October 7th. I think our book is a step in that direction, but we only have access to what we can get access to. Yeah. Obviously, we're not seeing everything. As journalists and as good as we might be, we're not able to get to everybody and to every document and every briefing and conversation that was ever had and every decision. But it's needed because we have to learn the lessons. The problem here is that it's very politicized. It's the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who I see as the person who set this policy and is responsible for a lot of those failures that led to October 7th. But we also have to give him credit where it's deserved in re-engineering the Middle East, taking on Hezbollah, taking on Iran, changing the reality, helping to lead to the downfall of Assad in Syria. All of this is also his credit. So it's a coin with two sides. But the commission of inquiry is needed. And for now, the government is refusing to establish one. The opposition, of course, in this country wants one. Most of the people want to see one established. But I'll tell you something. I looked at the 9/11 Commission, and I saw the parallels there. And one of the recommendations that we make in the book is to potentially set up in Israel what you have in the United States called the DNI, right? Directorate of National Intelligence.
Yep.
back in, I think, in the U.S. right now, you have about 17 or something different intelligence agencies.
Oh,
and
there's way more than that. They have to use tax cutouts and contractors, but yeah, maybe on paper there's
you got whatever. It's a lot of intelligence agencies,
for sure.
And each one was acting in its own silo. And I had a piece of information, and you had a piece of information, but we weren't sharing it together. And what the recommendation was, and then it was put into law, was that there would be a directorate that's established. Right now, it's Tulsi Gabbard, who's the director of national intelligence. But the idea being that there is going to be one clear governance and an entity that is going to synchronize between intelligence agencies and make sure that everybody's talking to one another, everybody's sharing intelligence, and everybody's seeing what others have, or at least there are people who are seeing the whole picture. In Israel, we have 3 intelligence agencies. We have military intelligence in the IDF. It's known by its Hebrew acronym Aman. We have the Mossad, that's like our CIA.
Yep.
And we have the Shin Bet, also known as the Shabak. It's something like the FBI, but it's also focused on Palestinian terrorism. Now, years ago, they did create a system. They called it the terminal, where everyone would feed in their intelligence, and everyone was theoretically supposed to have access to whatever the other person was gathering on the relevant fronts and operations. What we discovered is that a lot of that got lost. It got lost when moving up the chain of command. It wasn't seen by everybody. One of the recommendations, and we suggested, was maybe to establish a DNI of sorts to put everyone, and let me just add one other piece to that, which is also extremely important in a country like Israel, which is highly politicized because of the nature, the Israeli government system is a parliamentary system. So it's not like you have a president who decides everything and everyone serves at the pleasure of the president. Here, I could have a prime minister from one party and a defense minister from another party. Now, the defense minister oversees the IDF. The prime minister oversees the Mossad and the Shin Bet. Now, imagine for a moment that the prime minister and the defense minister don't get along. It's happened.
Yep.
I'm the defense minister. I want to invite the head of the Mossad to a meeting in my office. He's got to get permission from the prime minister to come meet me in my office. Now, that's just stupid. That's negligent. We have to find a way to prevent this stupid kind of political games that are sometimes played from happening. One of the ways to do this is to create a clear, one streamlined system for all the intelligence agencies. I hope something like, there's a lot of talk about it, but again, this will have to be done in a way that is understood by the leaders of this country that these changes are needed. And so far, I've yet to see that they understand that.
Yeah. Last question for you today. If you were invited to the Israeli cabinet, they're going to give you 5 minutes on the floor and they have to do what you tell them. What would you say to them in that 5 minutes?
Wow.
All they get to do is take notes and then they have to take action.
I would say to them 2 things. I would say we have to live in this country with a sword in our hand at all times. We have to adopt completely a policy of preemptive action. We cannot fall back into a policy of containment. But at the same time, in the other hand, we have to keep that hand stretched out to recognize, to identify opportunities, and to take advantage of them. And I'll give you just 2 quick examples. Syria right now is a perfect example. You have a guy, Ahmed Ashara, HTS, former Al-Qaeda, fought against American troops in Iraq, right? Not a good guy.
Yeah.
But he's now wearing a suit. He traded in his army fatigues, his terrorist uniform for a suit now. He's trying to take Syria in a new direction. So we have to be vigilant. We have to, of course, be suspicious. But at the same time, we should be reaching out to him and saying, okay, maybe there's an opportunity here. I look at Lebanon. Hezbollah is still there. But there's a government now in Lebanon. We're hearing about a potential deal that they will collect the weapons of Hezbollah. There's an opportunity for us to maybe do something with Lebanon, to normalize relations. There will be a price to pay, of course. We'll have to do something. We'll have to give them something. So I want to see that one hand ready to fight at all times and to be fighting at all times, but also at the same time to not miss the opportunities that are there, because there are opportunities in this new Middle East. We can't ignore the fact that we are safer from a security perspective than we were on October 7th or October 6th. All our enemies are degraded, right? They're not what they were.
Yep.
So you have an opportunity now, and you have a responsibility as the government to take advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah, I don't know how many of those notes they would take, but I agree with your sentiment. I feel like half of them be like, oh, yes. The other half be like, nope, not listening.
Probably. Yes.
Yeah. Where's the best place people can support you by buying your book?
While Israel Slept, it's for sale where books can be found. So you can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, some book select bookstores.
As an author, is there a portal that benefits you more than another one, or are they all kind of the same? Just find it wherever you can find it.
They're all kind of the same. You can also go through my website, yaakovkatz.com, but wherever you find the book is great. And I hope that people read it, enjoy it, and learn lessons from it.
Thank you again for listening to Change Agents, an Ironclad original, presented by Firecracker Farm. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode and an all-new guest. See you then.